You found the skeleton. How would you tell people that this happened? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. Today we are once again looking at Answers News, because they're awful. But I'm also tired of doing big multi-part hours-long series, and I need a break from that. As is normal now, there is no Ken Ham, but we do get Georgia, who occasionally reins in her co-hosts when they get completely off the rails, but usually she doesn't. Today we are also joined by Patricia Engler, a transfer from AIG Canada, and Kevin Hadsell, who's new. One last thing before we get into it. Before we start, I would appreciate if you could like this video and subscribe to the channel. Growing a channel on YouTube is not easy, and while I wish I didn't have to ask you to like and subscribe, when I don't, people tend to forget. Well, without further ado, take it away, Kevin.
Are bats evolving in real time?
Yes, all organisms are evolving in real time, except I guess the ones who are on their last generation before extinction.
Welcome to Answers News for Monday, April 29, 2024.
Well, now we all know when this was made. It doesn't matter much since this isn't really a news show, it's a pop sci review show with occasional bigotry for fun.
In today's top story, an Australian researcher thinks he spotted evidence for evolution. Has he?
Probably. It's extremely easy to spot if you know what you're looking for.
Hello, I'm Dr. Georgia Prodom. This is Patricia Engler and Kevin Hadsell. Kevin is brand new to Answers News. He is a content associate for Answers in Genesis. He's an Air Force veteran as well as an aeronautical engineer, so he's a really smart guy.
An engineer, eh? The Salem hypothesis strikes again. That's an informal observation that among those creationists who claim scientific training or expertise, most tend to be engineers. And while I am in no way suggesting that engineers are not smart or vital to society, a degree in engineering is as useful to talking about most things in creationism as a degree in sociology or Russian literature.
And we're thankful to have him on board here at Answers in Genesis. Well, let's get right to our top story. Same species, different sizes. Rare evolution in action spotted in island bats.
This article is based on the paper Parallel Evolution in an Island Archipelago Revealed by Genomic Sequencing of Hippocyteros leaf-nosed bats by Tyrone H. Lavery et al. It is linked in the description, as is the phys.org article that they're referencing.
Now, whenever I see an article that says evolution in action, I have to ask, what are they actually seeing?
A population or group of related populations with evidence of change in allele frequencies across generations, because that's what evolution is. The fact that Answers in Genesis constantly feel the need to misrepresent evolution says a lot about them. In fact, redefining technical terms in science is itself a sign of pseudoscience.
Okay, what are they actually observing? Because evolution is something that takes a long time, right? It's a long process over millions of years of random chance.
I mean, it depends on exactly what you mean. If you just mean a change in allele frequencies over generations, then it takes however long the generation time is at a minimum. But usually when we say that evolution takes a long time, what we really mean is that significant changes to gross morphology via evolution takes a long time. But that's not the same thing. The word evolution is context-dependent, like basically all words. But the thing is, it's really not hard to figure out what is meant in basically every case, and I don't think Georgia is actually confused. I think she's trying to confuse her audience by pretending that evolution isn't well-defined, when it really is.
So when they use terminology like that, my question is that what they really mean?
Is what they really mean? What they really mean in this case is that they can see evidence of rapid and recent speciation, along with the convergent evolution of a large body size in a genus of bat. That this is detectable via genetic sequencing means this is definitely an example of evolution. In case you're wondering, the paper is about a few populations of bats on the Solomon Islands, where there are populations of relatively small and relatively large bats. Other than size, the morphologies of the groups is virtually identical, and it was thought that all the large bats constituted one monophyletic species. Genetic testing suggests that in fact that is not true, and at least two lineages of large bats exist, which develop their size independently, as a result of similar ecological pressures. This also all happened quite recently, given how extremely similar the bats are genetically and morphologically, meaning it also happened fairly quickly.
You know, is that what they're really talking about?
Well, they're really talking about real evolution, if that's what Georgia is asking about.
And what this is basically it's a leaf-nosed bat, which you can see the lovely picture here of the leaf-nosed bat. And there are many different species of it, and they're on these different islands. And what they found is that there are species that are very large, and there are species that are very small.
No, that was already known. Indeed, the specific designation given to the large bats, Hippocyteros dinops, is from 1905, which is when they were first formally described by Knut Anderson. The genus itself goes all the way back to 1800, where the first member, H. spioris, was identified by German naturalist Johann Gottlob Schneider. What was found out is that H. dinops is probably polyphyletic, and should probably be split into at least 2 species, since the morphology used to identify that species seems to be evolved independently in at least 2 lineages.
And they don't interbreed, and they say that, well, this is because of what they call parallel evolution, that both these bats have evolved. They're not breeding with one another, so they are distinct species.
Again, that was already known and was not a new discovery. The question was never, are the large and small bats different species? They are morphologically, behaviorally, and ecologically distinct and do not interbreed. That means they are 2 species under basically all species concepts. The question is whether or not H. dinops, the larger bats, are properly a single species, and the conclusion of the paper is that no, they aren't. It's for reasons like this that I don't think they even really read the articles much past the first paragraph or 2, and they never go into the actual peer-reviewed paper. Georgia isn't an idiot. She has a PhD in genetics. She can understand this article and paper. That she is misrepresenting it either means she's lying about having read it, or she's lying about it after having read it. And before someone says that technically she didn't say she read it explicitly, giving a summary and critique of something implies that you consume that piece of media. If you do that without having done so, you're lying.
But I'm like, that's not evolution.
Well, I mean, she's right. There being a couple species of bat isn't on its own evolution. It's also not the finding of the paper. The paper was about evolution, not just identifying a big bat species and a small bat species. So in order to say that this headline is wrong, Georgia's basically strawmanning the entire article and the paper it's based on. Classy, Georgia. Really classy.
Because they're just different in size.
Yeah, and? If that size difference is primarily the result of genetic differences that have arisen through selection, mutation, and drift resulting in changes to the genome in populations over generations, then it's evolution.
Right? They're not fundamentally different.
That doesn't really mean anything. This isn't Platonism, where there is some ideal bat, and we only recognize bats because of their participation in the idea of batness that exists eternally beyond the universe. The idea of something turning into a fundamentally different thing simply isn't a part of biology, because what counts as fundamental isn't clear, nor is it clear that evolution posits that this has ever happened, even if it is made clear. Are bats fundamentally different from their closest relatives, ungulates, carnivorans, and pangolins? Well, they're all genetically similar, and they have some unifying morphological features. What would it mean for them to be fundamentally different from, say, a deer? They both have mostly the same bones arranged in the same order. They have nearly identical embryological processes. Their biochemistry is very similar.
They're not a bat becoming a non-bat.
That's because of monophyly. The idea that groups of organisms are defined by their ancestry, and that you can't escape your ancestry. It's like an append-only ledger. If you had bat entered into your ledger, you can't take it off. You can only add new entries. And if anyone looks at their ledger, bat will always be there. You can't evolve so much that your ancestors are no longer your ancestors. That doesn't even make sense. Bats will always be bats, even if they turn into horrible hand-walking flightless super predators or something.
Okay, or something else. That's what evolution is. That's molecules to man over eons of time.
No, that's fundamentally what evolution is not. If bats somehow stopped being bats, it would fundamentally break the most basic rule of evolution. Evolution is about descent with modification. In fact, if you need a 3-word definition for it, descent with modification is it. The descent part fundamentally means you can't just stop being what your ancestors were. You're a modification on what they were.
This is just simply showing that there's variations within this particular bat kind, resulting in 2 different species.
This kind thing is related to the whole fundamentally different thing. For those of you who are new to the world of young Earth creationism, a kind is just a group of organisms without any ancestral relationship to other organisms. Creationists like to pretend that they can put this at the family level in taxonomy, as if family level was an objective thing that exists in nature, rather than just an arbitrary label humans put on some particular groups of related organisms. Not that the relatedness is arbitrary or fake, that part is real, but where within the nested hierarchy you place the family label is fundamentally arbitrary. So basically, creationists look around the tree of life and arbitrarily place the label kind on various groups of organisms. They don't do so with any rigor or consistency, but it results in basically the same tree of life, but cut off so that the branches appear on their own. They still recognize higher taxonomic levels, such as mammal or bird, but they have no real explanation for their existence beyond just, God likes it that way. The basic contention of evolution is simply that there is only one kind within extant life on Earth, and it agrees with creationists that you can't go from one kind to another, because that would fundamentally violate the principle or law of monophyly, which we've already described. If one could somehow actually change kinds, then it would falsify both evolution and young Earth creationism as taught by Answers in Genesis.
So, Kevin, we'll let you talk about this
Yeah.
first. What do you think about this?
Ah yes, the engineer's perspective.
Yeah, so what really stuck out to me, this quote in here says, "We may think of evolution as a very slow process, but it can happen rapidly when the conditions are right." Now, they didn't observe evolution.
So he's right in one way. They didn't watch the actual changes in these populations occur, but they saw the very obvious evidence that it did happen. Here's an analogy. Say you're driving and you see in the median a bunch of cop cars with their lights going, ambulances, a fire truck, 2 civilian cars all crumpled up, and shards of glass all over the place. You'd probably say that you just saw a car crash. Technically, though, what you saw was just the aftermath of a car crash. But does that change the fact that the crash happened? Or that you're not wrong to say that you saw a car crash? I would argue no. Anyone who wants to say there simply was no car crash has to do more than just point out that you didn't actually see the collision as it happened. You have what is very obviously the results of a crash in front of you, and if they want to claim that there was no crash, they need to actually provide very solid reasons as to why not. It's the same thing with this. There is extremely obvious genetic and morphological evidence of evolution among these bats, and if the Answers News team wants to disagree, then pointing out that the evolution wasn't observed as it happened by the researchers pointing to it isn't going to cut it.
What they observe is perfectly consistent with biblical creation, as Dr. Purdom explained.
But the thing is that the prediction, bats can't evolve to be not bats, is a prediction shared by young Earth creationism and science. That the prediction hasn't been shown wrong doesn't help one side against the other.
In fact, it's even consistent with the creation model, the created heterozygosity and natural processes model. That's a mouthful.
It's actually not, but let's let Kevin tell us what he means so I don't strawman him.
But here's what it means in simple terms. One of the main tenets is God created this enormous amount of genetic variety up front in the created kind. So there's a lot to select from. And that's how you have the variation within the kinds. So we would say that speciation can happen rapidly within a created kind.
First, for those of you who have either not paid attention or just forgotten high school biology, heterozygosity is when your copies of a particular gene are different, and it's contrasted with homozygosity, where your copies are the same. Recall that humans, like most animals, have 2 sets of chromosomes in pairs. On each pair, there are essentially the same genes in the same places on the chromosomes. But the genes can be different versions, called alleles. If you have different alleles for a particular gene, you're heterozygous for that part of your genome. So basically, the idea of created heterozygosity is that the original members of the groups of organisms God created had the maximum amount of heterozygosity possible, which is to say that they were heterozygous at every point in the genome that could tolerate it without killing the organisms, or making them infertile, or something like that. Okay, but there are some problems with this. First, it makes a very clear prediction about the genomes of organisms, specifically that the vast majority of diversity within a so-called kind should coalesce to the same point in the past when you run the genomes through a coalescence analysis. That is, an analysis to see when the various parts of the genome last shared a common genetic ancestor. Instead, the different parts of the genomes of all tested organisms have wildly different coalescence times. This simply falsifies created heterozygosity. But also, since this means that speciation is primarily the result of a loss of genetic diversity, we should predict that organisms with similar traits must be closely related, because otherwise it would mean the independent loss of particular genetic sequences in all but a few widely disparate lineages. But that is fantastically less likely than simply different mutations in a few groups. In other words, in these bats, it would mean that all the lineages of bats had the genetics to be large, like the current bats grouped under H. dinops. But all of them independently lost those genetic traits, except the 2 groups of big bats that are still around. What's far, far more likely, just from a statistical standpoint, is that the 2 large bat lineages independently had some mutations that resulted in a large body size. This isn't as strong a point as the coalescence, but still, it means that even if we ignore the falsification of created heterozygosity, it's still not the explanation that actually makes the most sense of the data. So we should probably not entertain it until we can make useful predictions that come true, rather than simply poorly explaining data post hoc less effectively than the standard model. Of course, another problem is that modern animals should all have lower diversity than those in the past, but we have genome sequences from the past, and there is no obvious decrease in genetic diversity from the past.
And the reason why that's really significant is because a lot of times we get the question, if there are 30,000 plus land animals and birds living today that are descendants of the about 1,400 kinds on board the Ark, then how do you have so much speciation in just a few thousand years?
The real answer is, you just can't, and created heterozygosity does nothing to fix this problem. Speciation takes time, no matter if it's the result of different populations losing diversity in different ways or not. In fact, in some lineages, like elephantids, to get to the alleged post-flood diversity in time for when we know it existed on young Earth creationist timelines, you need organisms speciating every single generation.
Well, what they observed here is perfectly consistent with that.
Well, except that it's not, though, because there's no indication that the speciation shown in the paper is the result of a loss of original genetic diversity. That would have to be the case in order for the paper to be consistent with created heterozygosity.
It actually very much supports the creation model, from the number of kinds on board the Ark to the number of species today.
Actually, it doesn't, because it's worse than I've been saying for creationists. You see, the three distinct morphologies of small body, medium body, and large body are not distributed such that the different body sizes form clades that can be easily explained by losing original diversity. Instead, they're all over the place, with the small body size being most widespread, and therefore most likely to be the ancestral trait. Medium body occurs only once, and large body twice, each time more or less in isolation, rather than clustering with similar body sizes. This means that by far the most likely scenario is that these bats all evolved from small-bodied ancestors, and that the genetics for large body size were novel mutations that occurred after the various splits in the population. This is directly contrary to the idea of created heterozygosity. You can see this on the screen. If created heterozygosity were true, what we should expect is for all the small bats, represented by the circle, to cluster together, and for the large bats to do the same, and most likely for the large-bodied bats to be the most basally branching group, followed by the medium bats. This kind of tree could be explained plausibly by one group of bats losing the alleles for large body size, and then an even smaller group losing even the alleles that would allow for the small body size, followed by the medium and large groups losing the alleles for smaller body size. But that's not what we see. In the actual tree put forth in the paper, the groups would have to all retain both large and small alleles almost right to the present, and then simply mysteriously lose them only in the latest stages of diversification. For instance, in the green small body bat labeled PNG, that lineage could have lost the large body trait quickly, but then the other branch had to retain it. Then New Britain could have lost it, but the other branch would have to retain it. Then Makira has to just keep the specific allele for medium size, while the other branch has to maintain the full body size diversity. Then separately, 4 lineages have to all lose the large body size trait, while one keeps it. And this has to be the case until very recently, in at least lineages like those leading to Guadalcanal and Isabel small bats. But this independent loss is extremely unlikely just statistically. And it also implies that they had multiple sets of alleles for bigness, which all had to be lost, except in 2 large body groups of bats, which had to lose the other group's genetic markers, but not their own, both of which were associated with essentially the same morphology for some reason. This requires so many unlikely events that it stretches the limits of credulity. The other option is, hey, a bunch of small bats got to the Solomon Island, had some mutations that increased the body sizes in a couple lineages, that proved advantageous for the population, and also tended to enforce genetic isolation between themselves and the morphologically basal small-bodied bats. There you go, end of story.
Yeah, well said. And it's a great example of how when we start with God's word, that actually gives us good scientific predictions for good science. Creation is great for science.
Except that creation science would predict a different tree that we do not see. So no, it's not good for science. It's demonstrably less useful in science than the ideas of actual scientists.
We expect that God will have kind of front-loaded the genome with all this potential to have lots of variation, and then you see lots of different species within that.
Which is at odds with what we see in nature.
You don't see evolution between kinds, bats evolving into something else. And actually, I found an article from the journal Nature from just a month ago saying that the evolutionary transition to powered flight remains controversial in bats.
Controversial how? It's certainly not controversial that it happened. This is like pointing out that there's controversy over the route that Hannibal took to get to Rome. It's true, there is. But what's not controversial is that he did get to Rome. Pointing out the controversy of how he did it isn't an argument that it didn't actually happen.
Our understanding of the origins of bat flight is precarious.
In a shocking turn of events, science doesn't know everything, and doesn't claim to. Further, I'm getting reporting that this fact doesn't actually negate the things that we do know from science. Interesting. Let's see how this story unfolds.
Right, you don't actually see how this could evolve in the first place. Bats' wings are very complex.
I mean, fundamentally, they're not more complex than human hands. They're hands with very long fingers and webbing of skin. In fact, in embryos, all tetrapod digits start out webbed. A particular signal is normally sent to the tissue between the digits that causes it to die, which allows the digits to separate. At the most basic level, getting a bat wing is a matter of keeping the growth signal on the digits for longer, and turning off the programmed cell death signal. Granted, there's actually more to it than that, but that's the basic part of it. That can get you off to the races of gliding, and then further selection for adding energy to your glide can cause selection for things like a more powerful downstroke, higher neuron diversity around the hairs of the arms for sensory input, about things like airspeed, etc. Further, complexity simply isn't a barrier to evolution. No matter how complex something is, that's not on its own a reason it couldn't evolve. Saying something is too complex to have evolved is like saying that a race car is too yellow to have won a race. It just doesn't make sense.
There's another article from Science back in 1999, it hasn't changed much since then, that said, for use in understanding the evolution of vertebrate flight, the early record of pterosaurs and bats is disappointing.
It's true. It is. Really, the only flying organisms with a good fossil record for their transition from fully terrestrial to having powered flight are birds. We do have a stemmed pterosaur in Scleromoculus, but it's extremely basal and doesn't show us a lot about the actual evolution of the flight organs of pterosaurs.
The most primitive representatives are fully transformed as capable flyers.
Well, just as I pointed out, that's no longer true of pterosaurs, but it's still a pretty spotty record, to put it mildly.
So what we see in the real world fits a biblical worldview.
Yeah, there's a problem with that. Creationism would also predict no transitionals for birds, but, there are lots. For example, So, that's a failed prediction for creationism and a confirmed prediction for evolution, meaning it's time to toss creationism in the trash. If you want to help me toss creationism in the trash, consider hitting the join button below this video to join the channel memberships. You get early access to my videos, access to a super secret supporter-only Discord server, and cool emojis for use in comments and live stream chats.
And what these bats are doing is really they're filling different ecological niches, so they do have different sonar frequencies.
That's true.
So the larger bats obviously are looking for larger prey because they can handle that, right? They may do amphibians, not just insects, and the smaller bats are doing probably more insects.
Well, that's a hypothesis in the paper. There's no actual positive evidence for the larger bats taking amphibians as prey. It's just that they seem large enough to eat small frogs, but they haven't been observed doing so. That being said, it's not a well-studied group of animals, and being flying nocturnal predators in a dense jungle, they're not really easy to study.
Eating more. So they're filling different niches within the same ecosystem, so they can both live, they can both thrive and survive in that by eating different things.
Yes, this is a great example of a phenomenon in evolutionary biology called niche partitioning. Two organisms with the same niche cannot persist in an environment long-term. So, when a particular niche is full, it provides selection pressure for organisms that would normally fill that niche to evolve to fill a different one. In the case of these bats, the niche of eating the prey consumed by the small bats was already full, so larger bats that could prey on different things evolved, allowing the two populations to coexist.
Okay, and so, yes, it's a fallen world, and that's why things eat each other now. That wasn't the way it was originally.
It doesn't actually say that anywhere in Genesis. That's a strained and tortured reading only made possible by taking the much later work of Romans, reading it in an extremely literal way, and then using that to change the meaning of Genesis.
But it's really amazing to see how God has given the ability to these bats, given that genetic information needed to be able to thrive and survive in this fallen world.
Except, again, that interpretation doesn't actually make sense of the data that we're seeing. But I've already gone over that.
One thing I just want to share real quick is this book called Replacing Darwin, Dr. Nathaniel Jensen's model here, which very much replaces the Darwinian view.
You serious?
Everything that we read in here is perfectly consistent. If you want to learn much more about how God created the genetic diversity to begin with and how isolation of populations then leads to that speciation, very highly recommend this book to learn in more detail.
Yeah, great research.
The problem is that book isn't even internally consistent. The book pretends that things like natural selection and genetic drift don't exist in some places, and then invokes them in others. It invents whole cloth without rigorous or quantifiable explanation, terms like speciation capacity. It tosses out relevant data without a word, and it flat lies about the data it does use. Above, I've linked the first part of a series by Dr. Dan of Creation Myths, going through the book for 4 hours in some detail. Check it out.
Great research, right? Creationists do research.
If by research you mean lying in a book that no real scientist will read except as part of their pseudoscience debunking hobby, then sure, I guess they do.
And we show that how that research and that scientific research confirms what God's word says.
Look, if you need to toss out data, be internally contradictory, and just flat out lie to show that science confirms God's word, then science doesn't confirm God's word. At least not your conception of it. The next bit is them whining about homeschooling laws in Australia or something. I don't care. Also, of course, they complain about school standards that are trans-inclusionary. So, once again, they're being turbo-bigots. And once again, I won't subject my trans viewers to that. They deal with enough without having to hear that shit on my channel. They also, of course, complain about the woke.
All right, so this one's been in the news a lot. And if you read the headlines, you're like, whoa, like this is amazing, right? What has happened? Scientists discover once in a billion-year event, 2 life forms merging to create a new cell part.
This is actually extremely cool. It's a species of algae that have inside them a structure that still looks a whole lot like a nitrogen-fixing bacterium, including having the DNA of a nitrogen-fixing bacterium, which is losing genetic material as the host alga takes over most of the metabolic work of supporting the structure, and the structure's reproduction is tied to the timing of the reproduction of the host cell, meaning that while it's technically an organelle for fixing nitrogen, it still very much looks like a modern nitrogen-fixing bacterium, and its close relatives still live in the ocean today. The article is linked in the description.
Now, I'm a cellular molecular biologist by training, so things like this always are fascinating to me and interesting to me.
Of course, meaning she won't be misrepresenting the story in any way, right?
And so I read it and I'm like, no, they have not observed a once in a billion year event.
Oh, I didn't know Georgia had a bunch of other examples of primary endosymbiosis up her sleeves.
They are observing something, okay? So it's observational science. It's something we observe in the present, and then they're putting on it all these evolutionary ideas about how that thing came to be.
So what's George's explanation of how the Croococale cyanobacterium, Atelocyanobacterium thalassa, came to have some, but not all of the characteristics of an organelle, while still obviously being a member of its order, which consists ordinarily of free-living nitrogen-fixing cyanobacteria? I can tell you, creationists certainly never indicated this is something we should find, but the whole idea of endosymbiosis predicts that it should be the case that structures intermediate between free-living bacteria and eukaryote organelles should exist.
That they have not observed, that they have not seen, that they have no idea about, right? And so that's really what we need to understand here, the difference between those two. So
just, nuh-uh. Got it.
What this is all cells, like animal cells, plant cells, have what are called organelles, okay? Tiny little organs inside.
Well, it's arguable if prokaryotes have organelles in the same way that eukaryotes do, so it's not quite right to say that it's the same thing all cells have.
They do things that the cell needs it to do. And so the idea of how we got these organelles, or at least some of these organelles, has come about through what is called endosymbiotic theory. Okay, so it's a very, very long kind of jargon-filled term there, endosymbiosis. The idea that billions of years ago...
Well, there's no requirement that it happened billions of years ago. This instance seems to be about 100 million years old. It's just that the example is mitochondria, and that would have happened about 1 billion years ago.
These cells engulfed other cells, and it kept that cell, and that cell developed a very specific sort of function. So, for example, that's how animal cells got mitochondria, which...
Nope, not just animals, all eukaryotes. That includes things like plants, fungi, amoebas, and algae.
To the powerhouse of the cell. That's how plant cells got chloroplasts, which are the powerhouse of their cells.
Jesus Christ, Georgia, you just told us you were a cell biologist and a PhD, no less. You very well know that plant cells also have mitochondria and that chloroplasts create sugar, which the mitochondria then turn into ATP. I know you know this because you just bragged about your amazing PhD expertise. And if you don't know that very basic thing, Georgia, then what is the point of you? What good is that PhD?
One of the powerhouses. So...
What is that? An admission she's wrong? I mean, maybe I'm not being charitable enough here, but first she said that mitochondria were an animal organelle, and then she contrasted them with chloroplasts. If she wanted to impart the idea that she thinks that animals have mitochondria and plants don't because they have chloroplasts, I don't know how much more clearly she could have implied that.
So that's kind of how they're explaining it, right, from an evolutionary standpoint.
Well, except for the inexplicable idiocy around whether or not anything besides animals have mitochondria, Yes.
But what's the problem with that, Patricia, from, just a complexity standpoint?
Well, I don't know. It seems like, if anything, mitochondria are more simple than bacteria, to which they're very closely related. So it seems like even if complexity were relevant, which it's not, that wouldn't matter in this case.
Yes, so I found actually a paper from 2017 in the article Current Biology just explaining some of the steps you would need to have this happen. So they said the transition would entail a massive number of evolutionary changes, including the origins of hundreds of new genes and a protein import system, insertion of membrane transporters, integration of metabolism and reproduction, genome reduction, endosymbiotic gene transfer, lateral gene transfer, and the retargeting of proteins.
Which is happening in front of our eyes in these algae as we have a living intermediary stage between symbiote and organelle. She's looking at an airplane in the air and then complaining that heavier-than-air flying machines are preposterous.
All right, so a lot of technical terms, but basically cells are crazy complex. There's all these interrelated systems of very specific transport proteins that you need to get DNA and proteins from one place to the other and back.
But the reason that's the case is because fundamentally you're trying to interface between what were completely separate organisms that didn't interface before. That you need all these targeted transfer proteins to travel across all these membranes is because fundamentally, and now in proto-organelle form, nitroplasts are their own living cells inside of a larger cell. But further, we can see in the example that they're citing right now that we don't actually need all of that in order for endosymbiosis to occur and start evolving toward integration as an organelle. Telling us how this is too much change and impossible rings kind of hollow when you're talking about it happening right now in front of our eyes in a known species of algae that is in the process of turning a known species of cyanobacteria into an organelle while its relatives are still free living in the ocean.
That can't evolve by random chance over eons of time.
Sure, probably not. Good thing random chance is an absurdly bad way to describe the process of evolution.
Because the relationship between all of the organelles within the cell is extremely complex.
Yeah, now after billions of years of evolution, but as we can see, and I can't emphasize this enough, in the very thing they're talking about, this is a spectrum from just engulfing another cell, to partial integration as an organelle, to fully integrating the organelle into just being a part of the host cell's biology.
And so what they have found now with this, so I talked about the mitochondria and the chloroplast, they have actually found basically a microbe that is able to fix nitrogen. So it's able to take nitrogen from the atmosphere and fix it into a form that it can use, because nitrogen as a gas isn't usable in anything. It needs to form it into ammonia or something that can be usable.
Well, ammonium. But the significant thing is that in this case, we now have the only known eukaryote that can do this without the help of a symbiotic but still free-living prokaryotic symbiote. Some plants, like legumes, have nodules in their roots that house nitrogen-fixing bacteria, but those bacteria are still separate organisms, like the bacteria in your gut. But now we are seeing in front of our eyes an alga that has a structure inside of its cell that can fix nitrogen, and that is still recognizably part of a well-known cyanobacteria group, but one that is in the process of shedding some of its genes as it comes to rely on the host cell, and which has tied its reproductive timing to that of the host cell, meaning that this is a literal transition between the initial free-living bacterium and an organelle. If the origin of organelles from free-living cells via endosymbiosis is impossible, then why the is it happening right now?
By living things on Earth. So they're calling this a nitroplast, which is a brand new organelle that we have not observed before. I think that's really cool. Like, as a cell biologist, I'm like, it's amazing to look at God's design and the complexity he's created and realize we know so little of it and we're still learning it.
Except that we know of other species in this genus and they don't have nitroplasts. So even under the creationist idea of kinds, this is a novel trait to this one species. The rest of the kind doesn't have it. Meaning that this has to be something that happened after God created the kind. Meaning that this isn't something that had to be designed by God from the beginning. And of course, when it comes to organisms as different from humans as algae, creationists will often say that the kind is as big as a whole kingdom, which just makes this problem worse.
But again, we're observing it in the present.
Yes, we're observing an organism along the predicted line from separate organisms to host organism and organelle, as first proposed by Lynn Margulis, who originated the idea of endosymbiosis. This is a spectacular confirmation of her idea that was not at all predicted by creationism, and rather, according to Georgia herself, we shouldn't expect to see, because organelles are designed by God, so there's no way we should see something that is almost but not quite an organelle. But that's what we're seeing.
how it got there and how it came about, well, we know, starting with the biblical worldview, that this is the way God created it.
Aw, except it contradicts the only predictions we can really make from creationism. Sorry, not sorry.
But again, from an evolutionary standpoint, they have to try to explain all this amazing complexity in some way, with some kind of evolutionary model.
Yeah, that is a problem. Maybe it would help if we had an example of an organism that contained what is clearly a cyanobacterium from a well-known group of nitrogen-fixing bacteria, but that once inside the host organism was kind of reduced in its own genome, and it started to sync its biology to that of the host, and there had been some, but not too much, horizontal gene transfer to the host genome. And even better, close relatives of that same bacterium are still found all over the world. Oh, wait. That sounds like a job for Barudosphaera bigelowii, the very thing we're talking about. How convenient.
Yeah, and I came across another article that provided a little added context to what they were claiming.
He's just going to start reading that without saying what it is, where it's published, or when it's from. Or who wrote it. Maybe he'll do that later. I don't know. I didn't watch ahead.
And here's what it says. According to genetic analysis from a previous study, ancestors of the algae and bacteria entered a symbiotic relationship around 100 million years ago. They weren't there 100 million years ago to observe that.
Yeah, and I wasn't around to watch Kevin's weird soft human skull emerge from his mom's birth canal, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen. Look, I'm sorry that Answers News thinks that the very basic idea behind science, induction, is just invalid. But that's just them being anti-science. That's all that is. It's whining that when you take science seriously, it says things they don't like. Induction is the very idea that we can base our predictions of future data on past data. And the reverse. Present data can inform what happened in the past. Without this ability, there is no science at all. The very idea of this qualitative distinction between science about the past and science about present processes is logically incoherent. If the present cannot tell us about the past, then it cannot tell us about the future either. If I can't use genetic studies and arrive at coalescence and divergence times, then I can't use it in the future to predict the relatedness of future members of even my own family. Nothing could possibly be more anti-science than this absurd notion that we just can't know about the past short of eyewitnesses, because science is only applicable here and now. This is how you know that Answers in Genesis isn't a research group. They're not a group dedicated to real science or whatever. They're a profoundly and thoroughly anti-science hate group. That's it.
Now, as far as this genetic analysis that they did, I'm going to assume there's probably some sort of supposed DNA similarity, right?
Yeah, there is. Specifically, the nitroplast is part of the bacterial order Croococales. You know, an actual group of free-living bacteria that aren't organelles. It's a pretty basic part of the research that is hard to not notice unless you just didn't read the paper. And I'm sure Kevin did read the paper, right?
Between this nitrogen-consuming bacteria and nitrogen-consuming algae, right? And, well, God could have used the same building blocks in both.
Except that doesn't explain it. A nitroplast doesn't need a bunch of genes it's not using that wild nitrogen-fixing cyanobacteria need, except it has them. And we know it doesn't need them because the genome is shrinking, because that's part of the process of endosymbiosis. So if God created this one species of algae as its own kind, contrary to what AIG normally thinks about kinds, he did it in a way that just happens to look exactly what endosymbiotic theory would predict for an ongoing event of endosymbiosis. If that's what God did, then clearly he wants us to believe in endosymbiosis, since he needlessly set up the world to look like it's real. So I'm just going to believe it, lest I anger the great trickster god of the young earth creationist version of the Bible. One group of people that don't have the epistemic nightmare of needing to believe in an omnipotent trickster are my subscribers. So why not subscribe to the channel, and while you do, turn on all notifications. You might as well hit like, too.
Because it's a good design.
A good design that's characterized by going away, because it's obviously not well designed yet. Right.
And we can't scoff at that idea, that God would repeat a good design in different organisms.
I can, because it's already been repeatedly falsified. Neutral variations will build up in populations over time regardless of how well adapted they are to their environments. This is why neutral variation is so important in testing relatedness between lineages, because such mutations are not under selection. They are free to vary, meaning that such mutations can only be caused by the patterns of descent acting neutrally. The nucleotide sequences will not converge or diverge as a result of selection, which can obscure the phylogenetic signal. And importantly, separate creation requires that neutral variation not be something that you can use to recover a nested hierarchy. Like it's mathematically impossible. And yet we do recover such a hierarchy. Separate ancestry has long since been falsified, no matter how much you want to say common design, common designer.
We as humans do that all the time.
Humans don't design whole organisms from the ground up all the time. There is no human design metaphor that works well for life. Even genetically engineered organisms have only minor edits inserted by humans. Even when humans made a whole synthetic genome and put it into a bacterium, it was almost entirely a copy of an already existing bacterial genome.
Think about vehicles. They all tend to have 4 wheels.
Except for the ones that don't, and that's a lot of them. And of course, vehicles don't have a genetic code. No vehicles at all are genetically related to each other through common ancestry. 2 identical cars that came off the assembly line one after the other are not related. For this reason alone, vehicles are a bad analogy for life. So bad, in fact, that I tend to suspect that they're an intentionally bad analogy.
They all tend to have an engine and transmission. They all tend to have a steering wheel, right? Those are pretty important.
Great, but do they all have a bunch of neutral components which are known to not do anything, but form a nested hierarchy for no other reason than that the cars themselves are genetically related because cars have a genome and cars make little baby cars? No, they don't.
Or airplanes. I'm an aeronautical engineer.
In other words, a guy who has no idea what he's talking about, but thinks that everything works the way that the thing that he knows about works.
They all tend to have wings. That's kind of important. They all tend to have engines.
Interesting. So does that mean that if the same design, same designer argument holds true, that since the 4 lineages that can fly have very different wings, they were designed by different designers? Seems like it would have to.
They all tend to have either a tail or a canard for static stability. They all tend to have redundant avionics for safety reasons.
Hey, yeah, that's another difference. The brains of flying creatures are all quite different. More evidence that life couldn't have a single designer, I guess. At least if you take creationist arguments seriously.
Right? It's good design. We do that. We repeat good designs. So
that's not what we see in life. It's a bad explanation for life. Got it.
There's no reason to scoff at the idea that God would repeat good designs in different kinds.
Cool, and if that were a reasonable way to characterize life as a whole, it might be a compelling argument for intelligent design. It's not, so it's not.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I mean, the fact of the matter is that God created plants on day 3.
I've never heard anything that makes sense starting with what day something was created according to Genesis 1. Maybe Georgia will break that trend.
Fully formed, fully functioning, with chloroplasts and their cells.
It's interesting that they would bring up chloroplasts. There is another species that is currently, perhaps, a bit further along in the process of turning a photosynthetic bacterium into a new kind of chloroplast that is not inherited from plant chloroplasts. That species is Polonella chromatophora. It was discovered in the Rhine River in 1894 by Robert Lauterborn. It contains a cyanobacterium. Its genome has been reduced to about a third the size of the typical cyanobacterium, but it's still about 10 times larger than what is typical of other organelles like chromatophore's chloroplasts and mitochondria. And the nuclear genome of Polonella now contains some of the genes typical of cyanobacteria that are now missing in the new almost chloroplast. So here in yet another species, one that's so unplant-like that it's even motile, we are seeing yet another endosymbiosis event taking place. The closest relative of Polonella chromatophora is P. ovalis, which isn't photosynthetic at all, but has been known to eat cyanobacteria. They're in the same genus, certainly the kind of thing creationists would call the same kind.
Right? He created animal cells on days 5 and 6, fully formed, fully functioning, with mitochondria in them.
So when did he make the bacteria that are more closely related to mitochondria than other bacteria? Was it on the animal day?
And this is yet another of these algal cells that have these ability to fix nitrogen and do this.
No, it's not just another one. It's the only one. These are the only eukaryotic cells that can fix nitrogen, period. Further, they do it in what looks exactly like the way you'd expect if they were in the middle of a process of integrating an endosymbiotic organism into an organelle.
These nitroplasts that we just discovered, he made those too at some point during creation week, right? We don't know whether it was day 3, 5, or 6, but at some point he made those.
George's fallacy is begging the question.
And fully formed, fully functioning, and amazingly complex.
Except that it's specifically not fully formed as an organelle. Normally, I don't even know how to parse the idea of an organism that isn't fully formed. In this case, though, I think it can be reasonably interpreted as the nitroplast being fully formed as an organelle, and no more resembling a free-living bacterium than does a mitochondrion. But that's the thing. It doesn't. It's much more bacterium-like than we would expect for a full-fledged organelle. So if anything, this is indeed not a fully formed organism.
Right? And so so when you see headlines like this, stop
Hammer time.
and look at what they actually found. What are they actually observing versus the ideas that they're trying to, we observe this in the present.
Yes, in the present, we're observing at least a couple instances of exactly what we'd expect from a relatively recent event of endosymbiosis. This was not predicted by creationists, but it is predicted by the idea of endosymbiosis. So we have seen evidence for an important part of the modern theory of evolution.
But the origin of, right, how it came to be is something they don't really know.
No.
Right, and it's totally based on their evolutionary ideas about the past.
But also, just basic genetic testing reveal that the nitroplasts aren't simply their own thing, but whatever. The next couple stories I'm skipping. One is about Bill Maher saying that abortion is kind of murder, but he supports it anyway. I don't care what Maher says. The next story is about a Finnish politician who's on trial for hate speech for sharing parts of the Bible used to justify homophobia, and she's doing it to herself justify homophobia. While I'm not a huge fan of the government making it an actual matter of law that one isn't allowed to be a bigot, I also have nothing to add. I'm sure this politician is a piece of shit, but whatever.
All right, our unique lineage, human evolution has run in complete reverse from other vertebrates.
Basically, this article is claiming that while most vertebrate groups speciate less when there is more interspecific competition, hominins seem to have done the opposite in the past. That's not exactly what I'd call evolution running in reverse, but it's contrary to the trend.
All right, so this is our weekly installment of, evolution got it wrong.
What exactly did it get wrong? But also, the name of that segment just translates to, why is science? Because in yet another indication of how deeply and fundamentally anti-science Answers in Genesis is, they think that adjusting your models to fit the data is a bad thing, rather than what it is, the only reason science actually works.
And now we need to rewrite that all over again, all right? Because
that's not what's being described here. All that's going on in this article is an attempt to explain data that was already known, such as which hominin species existed when and where. It's not trying to upend the chronology or pattern of hominin evolution.
That happens all the time. There's usually an article every week about that, how we got it wrong and now we need to redo it.
Yes, because it's a headline, which are usually misleading, but they get clicks. Because Answers News never, and I mean never, interacts with the primary literature, which is generally not full of clickbait. Now, my Patreon does have a bit of clickbait, but it's all honest. So if you're interested in supporting the channel in the place where I get to keep the most of your generous donation, that's the place to do it. You can get a 15% discount for making an annual pledge, and you get early access to my videos, as well as access to the same Discord server as channel members, as well as other perks at the higher tiers.
And so basically, the idea of this article is they're kind of dumbfounded by the fact that so many humans, what they call human species, have all coexisted at the same time. So,
nope, because that's pretty typical. It's the pattern of speciation that's under consideration. Why do hominins speciate is the question, not just the fact that they do. Most lineages speciate. It seems like, at least in part, tool use may help explain this, although it's also still possible that this seemingly unusual pattern of speciation among hominins is more of an artifact of the data than a real thing.
In the evolutionary lineage, and this is their model and their idea, is that we have a lot of these different human species. Now, when you look at what they classify as human species, many of them are apes.
No, all of them are apes because humans are apes. Humans are apes the same way that they're mammals or vertebrates.
Okay, they're not humans, but...
Well, yeah, some of them I probably wouldn't call human either, but the thing is, human is a colloquial word with no strict definition in science. Further, creationists can't even agree on which species are humans and which ones are, as they say, just apes. You'd think it would be easy to consistently separate them if humans are the special boys of creation and completely separate from apes.
Even with a few of them, like Neanderthals and Denisovans.
She's never going to pronounce Denisovans in anything that even approximates a reasonable pronunciation, is she?
And Homo florensis. Oh, I can never pronounce Latin.
Erectus, all those guys.
Yeah.
It's Homo floresiensis. I know these words aren't the easiest to say, but when it's literally part of your job to say them, you should probably work on getting them right.
Florensins, whatever. Those are all truly humans, right?
By what criteria? They certainly are genetically distinct from modern Homo sapiens, and we don't have any evidence of reproductive compatibility with H. sapiens and H. floresiensis. With H. neanderthalensis and Denisovans, we have evidence of only limited reproductive compatibility. For example, it seems that Neanderthals were not able to father children with H. sapiens females, but the reverse does not seem to be true.
But they're not different human species.
Yes, they are. They are morphologically distinct and persistent populations, making them different morphospecies. They are ecologically distinct, making them different ecospecies. They have at best only limited reproductive compatibility with Homo sapiens, making them at least strong candidates for being different biological species. And of course, in the case of Denisovans and Neanderthals, we have their DNA, and we know for certain that they fall outside the range of any modern or even archaic member of H. sapiens, making them a distinct phylospecies. So yes, they are definitively not the same species as the apes they are telling us that they are.
We would never say they're different human species.
She should, though, because they meet the criteria for being different species according to many different species concepts.
We would say that they are just variations within humankind.
But AIG thinks that each kind normally contains multiple species. So what does it matter if they think they're in the humankind? They could still be separate species.
Right? That probably occurred after the Tower of Babel when people split into different people groups as a result of that event.
An event that would predict that the center of human genetic diversity should be somewhere in Iraq. But it's not. It's basically in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. So that's a bit awkward.
And so they might have certain characteristics that are more dominant in their group versus others.
More than that, they have their own unique genetic diversity that nests outside of any known Homo sapiens group. You can't place them inside any human lineage that is known from any Homo sapiens.
But they're still humans, right? They can still breed with one another, unlike the bats that we talked about. At least we don't know that they breed together.
But that's only kind of true, though. And we don't know if it's true at all for H. floresiensis.
And so they can still do that. So they're still part of that humankind.
Again, this is meaningless even on creationist terms. Creationists think that lions and tigers are in the same kind, but they generally don't object to putting them into the separate species of Panthera leo and P. tigris, respectively.
But what they're saying is that why is it that so many species coexist at the same time rather than fighting each other and one winning out?
Nope, it's why so many new species come into existence, which isn't the same question as why so many exist. It's not a long article, and it's linked in the description. I'm pretty sure that if it were printed in a magazine like National Geographic, it wouldn't even make it onto a third page.
Yeah, I want to point out the, what do they call it? We're really a human and two apes that they point out at the beginning, right?
If a human and two apes sit down to dinner at the same table, that table has three apes.
In this article, they have Homo floresiensis. Those are just humans.
Well, they're late members of genus Homo, but they're far outside the morphological diversity known for Homo sapiens. For one, they are extremely small with small cranial capacity, and they also have unique tooth morphology in the canines and molars, all of which makes them distinct. Indeed, in mammal groups, tooth differences are often very important for species identification.
There's articles on our website about that.
And they're no more informative than this news show.
Now, they happen to be really short. They're just a few feet tall. Now, why are they so short?
Probably island dwarfism, but that doesn't explain the proportionally small brain case or the unique dental morphology.
We don't know for sure. It could be genetic variety, genetic issues.
I guess it would have to be genetic variety, since it seems that the height differences were probably genetic.
Homo luzonensis, which is just an ape. The fossil collection is pretty flimsy.
Well, it's certainly an ape, and it's true that the fossil record for it is quite sparse, but it's also much more like a human than it is like, say, an Australopithecus afarensis in what we have of it. So I'm not sure why it's not human, but H. floresiensis is. Basically, H. luzonensis is known only from some teeth, a partial femur, and a metatarsal bone.
Foot bone, finger bones, toe bones, leg bones, but all consistent with apes.
I'm not aware of any toe bones, but whatever. And of course it's consistent with apes. That's like saying Tyrannosaurus rex bones are consistent with dinosaur bones. Well, humans are apes, and T-Rex is a dinosaur, so yeah, that checks out.
There's Homo naledi, which has no visible evidence of protruding nasal bones typical of humans.
But also seen in some gorillas, so, you know.
They have small brain cases, 400 to 500 cc's, compared to humans, which have about, 1,000 to 1,500 cc's.
Interesting, so having a brain case between 400 and 500 cubic centimeters means that you're not a human. Too bad then that in 2013 Daisuke Kubo et al. Found that H. floresiensis specimen LB1 had a cranial capacity of 426 cc's. I guess H. floresiensis isn't a human after all.
They also have shoulder joints and curved finger bones that are consistent with apes.
Yup.
But the thing is that they group these three together, right? The Homo floresiensis, which they shouldn't be called a different species. They're just human.
Not according to the only criterion Kevin gave, that of cranial capacity.
Then they group them with apes in the same genus.
Says the guy who can't even give a criterion for what makes something human without contradicting his own assignment of some taxa to the so-called humankind versus the so-called ape kind.
Which is deceptive.
At least he admits that it's deceptive that he can't even tell us what a human is, and the one time he even tries, he ends up implying that a species he thinks is human isn't.
but it's all part of that, it's all that evolutionary worldview that's driving that classification.
Nope, these species can be identified as such using just morphological criteria, the same way that Carolus Linnaeus identified species. And he was a creationist. Indeed, he noticed that humans were apes, and even famously thought about putting orangutans in the same genus as humans.
Yeah, that's a great point.
It's barely even a point at all.
And I also thought it was funny, like this article is saying, well, look, all along there's been these overlaps between these like human species and these other creatures that they're calling hominids, when, as you pointed out, they're really not.
Hominid is the group of animals known as great apes. It includes chimps, humans, gorillas, and orangutans, and all of the things more like those guys than like gibbons. Whether these animals from the fossil record were human or not, however you define that, they were certainly hominids.
But I remember reading creationist books literally 10 years ago saying, actually, there's a lot more overlap within the evolutionists' own data than the evolutionists are actually saying. So that's just kind of another example of how this is something creationists have been saying for a long time.
But the thing is that isn't something that scientists weren't aware of decades ago. That's been clear for a long time. The fact that creationists were strawmanning paleoanthropologists decades ago, just as they are now, isn't a point in their favor. Further overlap between species is what we see now. It's an expected part of evolution. The fact that there is now only one hominin species is actually the weird thing.
We expect that all these different varieties of creatures would be living around the same time.
That's true. Creationism predicts that basically all species should overlap. So finding species that overlap is not at all a problem for them. What is a problem is when it seems like species didn't overlap. Why aren't there any humans of whatever species hanging out with Cotylorhynchus? Why aren't there any mammoths grazing with hadrosaurs? Why aren't there any dolphins swimming with ichthyosaurs?
And like you pointed out, they're either apes or humans. They're not these transitional forms.
Oh! If your elitist East Coast evolution is real, why has no one found the missing link between modern humans and ancient apes?
We did find it. It's called Homo erectus.
Then you have proven my case, sir. For no one has found the link between apes and this Homo erectus.
Yes, they have. It's called Homo habilis.
Aha! But no one has found the missing link between ape and the so-called Homo habilis.
Yes, they have. It's called Australopithecus africanus.
Oh, I've got you now. Fair enough. But where, then, is the missing link between apes and this Darwinius Massili? Answer me that, Professor.
Oh, okay, granted that one missing link is still missing.
And there's a great resource you can find on answers.tv, as well as our website. You can order it there, called 3 Ways to Make an Ape Man. And in it, I believe it's Dr. Menton who is explaining how...
Yeah, I'm going to stop her right there and instead just link to my video about that very talk. That has his talk and my response. Just watch that.
Yeah, and one of the things that's interesting is they say, well, normally we would say, they would say climate change is what caused, of course, because climate change causes everything, right?
No, it doesn't cause everything. But since, the climate is a major factor in what the environment is that an organism has to contend with, it sure does tend to drive evolution by natural selection.
That climate change caused these, this speciation and all, but they say actually technological innovations is what caused the speciation. Yep.
That is indeed the conclusion of the researchers referenced in the article. I'm not sure I buy it, but then I'm not a paleoanthropologist. But I'm willing to put money on it that Georgia has absolutely no rebuttal to their claim that even makes a lick of sense.
And so it's kind of interesting because in a lot of ways that fits with the Tower of Babel event because people spread out, they had different abilities to do different things, and now they were all separated.
I'm sorry, so did God confuse the languages along the lines of what jobs people had? Were the Egyptians stonemasons and the Chinese farmers and the Sumerians carpenters or something? Is there some significant evidence of high levels of expertise in each group of humans, but only rudimentary knowledge of all the other technologies? Not that I'm aware of. It would certainly be interesting to see such evidence, but we only have a bit less than a minute left before they start advertising for their books, so I don't think we're going to hear any of that evidence.
And so, they are kind of separated not based on technology, based on language, obviously, and the language that they spoke.
Oh, okay. So no, it doesn't correlate to technology. Meaning that this article doesn't seem to support anything like the Tower of Babel at all. Such an amazing display of intellect on today's panel.
But they take with them certain abilities to do certain things.
But if the language confusion isn't along the lines of expertise with technology, then there shouldn't have been any systematic differences in the technology among these groups. Of course, this is all ignoring the very obvious fact that just confusing the languages of the people at the tower wouldn't actually irrevocably split them into different groups. This is because of this one neat trick that Americans hate, called learning a language. It's a thing humans can do, and do all over the place, and have done for all of history.
And so in some ways, we see that being mirrored in what they're saying here, that, yeah, the technology was different. Eventually, it's able to be shared, and we have that in the global society that we live in today.
It was being shared long before that. That's why we have evidence of extensive trade across Africa and Eurasia going way back into the Bronze Age.
But initially, it would have been very separated into these individual groups as a result of that particular event.
Why, though? They started out in the same city, according to the story, and it's not like language learning only became a thing recently. If anything, exchange should have been easier right after the Tower of Babel than it was later, because they all would still have about the same culture, and they'd be physically proximate. Nothing about the story as Georgia is telling it makes sense at all.
Yeah, there's an interesting quote in here. They say, increased competition coincides with an increase in the formation of new species.
At least according to this article, but it's specifically interspecific competition, not just any competition. That's important.
Here's what came to my mind when I read that. I thought to myself, perhaps the only competition is modern-day paleontologists racing to name new species off of flimsy evidence and bad assumptions.
Yeah.
Look, I'm not going to say that that doesn't occur. There is prestige in being able to name a new species, and even more in being able to name a new genus. As a result, there are indeed times when a new taxon is erected on what turns out to be too little material, or on the basis of material that is not sufficiently different to warrant a new taxon. But you know who actually publishes the papers that correct this? Yeah, it's real scientists, not creationists.
A lot of ego goes into that for sure.
Just like a lot of ego goes into thinking that you know more than all the experts while not even being able to define what human is, despite thinking you're the ones who will overturn all of paleoanthropology. But that's it. After this, they just start plugging their books that they sell. AIG doesn't get free advertising time on my channel, so that's where we'll end things. I think you can see why I say that Answers News is awful. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like and tell me what you liked in the comments. If you didn't like it, hit dislike and let me know what the problem was. Either way, please subscribe if you haven't and turn on all notifications so that occasionally YouTube might tell you about my content if they feel like it, regardless of your wishes. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Hey, before you leave, I just want to take a second to thank my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above. Benthoven, Ferravara, Tapioca Weasel, Whispers, Elleron Teller, Horseflesh, Ian Chen, Kelvin Brostek Van Manen, Landon Knoll, Mabdy Babdy, Sphincter of Doom, Wallace, John Ackerman, Eta V, and Strawberry Vein. It's because of my channel members and patrons whom you're seeing on screen that this channel can stay afloat. Without you, it would all shut down. If you want to join the team, there's a link to join the channel below this video, and there's a link to join the Patreon in the description. On the Patreon, you can get a 10% discount for pledging annually, and either way, you get early access to virtually all of my scripted videos, often 3 to 5 months before they come out for the general public. Thanks for watching.